or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. In approximately 5 minutes, we'll start the ATBC webinar on communicating tropical biology and conservation to broad audiences. We'll just wait a couple more minutes and wait to get started until 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as several participants are still joining us. Marga or Lucia, do you want to give me the cue when to start? Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching Tropical Biology and Conservation webinar. This is part of the ATBC 2020 webinar series. I'm Ann Russell. I'm one of the co-hosts. I'm a faculty member at Iowa State University in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. My research is in tropical ecosystems, and I teach ecology. I'm also the PI for OCELOTS, an NSF project that brings together researchers, media specialists, database engineers to create online learning modules. My co-host is Mitch Ade.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. My name is Mitch Ade. I'm a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and I'm a tropical ecologist. My area of research in the last few years has focused on land use change in Latin America and using acoustics to improve monitoring of the fauna in these forests. Along with teaching classes at the University of Puerto Rico, over the last 20 years, I've participated in, I think, around 16 of the OTS courses in ecology and conservation for the Latin American students. That has been an incredible experience for me. I'm really glad that all of you are here, and I'm really looking forward to the talks and the discussions that follow. Thank you.
Well, many of us love doing research in the tropics, and we love bringing that excitement to our students. Unfortunately, even, there's not a lot of media available out there, or there are not a lot of online course materials for teaching in the tropics. And most of our work comes from the temperate zone that's in the textbooks. And so we kind of want to write that. We want to bring together researchers, educators, and database and media people to really uplift our education experience for undergraduates. And so with that, especially with the pandemic on, there's really a need for online materials. And we want to work together to really bring tropical biology and conservation into our undergraduate education. And today's list of webinar speakers and topics really kind of addresses that. The talks will follow kind of a natural arc, starting with field courses as a means to diversify and integrate tropical biology education across borders and disciplines. And this will be led by Jenny Stanaski at the Universidad de Costa Rica and Ursula Valdez at the University of Washington, Bothell. Then Suzanne Macy from the American Museum of Natural History will talk about evidence-based teaching approaches and active learning online. Finally, we'll end it with Rebecca Harden from the University of Michigan talking about open access teaching modules and resources.
Okay, before I introduce the first speakers, let's just go over a little bit of the logistics of the webinar. The attendees do not have access to the microphones or videos. You can communicate with the speakers and with us, the coordinators, through the question and answer. The chat, we can send you chat and information through chat, links to resources, but the way for you to communicate questions to us is through the Q&A component of the Zoom platform. Okay, our first speakers are Jenny Stanaski and Ursula Valdez. Jenny is a professor of integrated biology at the Clodomiro Picado Institute at the University of Costa Rica. And she studies the ecology and evolution of development of neuron chemical defenses. During the last 10 years, Jenny has coordinated or been the program director of many undergraduate and graduate courses with OTS, both in English and Spanish. And she's also taught other courses with other institutions in Costa Rica. Ursula is a faculty member of environmental science at the University of Washington, Bothell, and her research interests are in avian and raptor community ecology and its applications to conservation. Ursula teaches ecology, conservation, natural history, and many field courses. Since 2008, she has been taking her students from Washington to Peru, where she's from, And she's been teaching them tropical ecology, conservation, and sustainability. She's also been an instructor on many courses in Costa Rica. In addition, Ursula is returning to Peru to work with the Centro de Educación, Ciencia y Conservación in Tamaulipas to help train young Peruvians in field research, conservation, education, and sustainability. And you can see from this introduction, we have 2 stars of field courses in the tropics, and I'm really looking forward to hearing their talks. You guys can take it away.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Anne, for that introduction. So I'm going to start my sharing. And Jenny and I are very happy to be here today. And first of all, thanks everybody for inviting us and the group of OCELOTS for integrating in this effort to work in tropical ecology. So Jennifer and I are going to be we're very excited to share with the rest of you a lot of examples about how we have integrated not only science-based training, but also other means to use tropical ecology across disciplines, across borders, and just creating environments that are safe and inclusive in our practices. So I bet that many of you guys here and all of us who are most of us who are in this panel, we have been part of a classic field ecology in the tropics, field course in the tropics. Many of you guys will remembering like gathering with a lot of students, hiking in the forest, doing short projects or experiments, interacting with professors and guest speakers, and just having an intense and hands-on opportunities while testing hypotheses in these ecosystems and working obviously with like some peers and just sharing that. I mean, those have been incredible times that have inspired many of us. Oops. So as tropical ecologists, Jenny and I, probably as many of you here today, we're here because we were trained in the field. As educators, as ecologists, as conservationists, this experience have had like life-changing impacts in all of us, has sharpened our skills in science, hypothesis testing, doing experiments, doing studies in the field, has opened our eyes to the endless questions that are there in tropical ecosystems. And it has pushed us to what we want to be, what we want to do in the future, and what we're doing now, right? And sharing all of this with amazing teachers and classmates. So we soak in, we got excited about this like air in the tropics, the humid and like environments, and then the energy and positive field vibes that we got in there. So really, living, smelling, and learning about the biodiversity every hour and every minute in the field has been an incredible experience for us. Jenny,
it has. Thank you. I agree completely. I think another thing we can all agree about is that the world is dynamic and it's changing, especially after everything this year, right? And these things are true, especially in the tropics where everything is very complex. I think we can all agree also that science must adapt to these changes and science training to go along with that. And so in this talk, Ursula and I hope to open up a conversation about how field courses can continue to evolve, especially with regards to how course content can help our community of tropical ecologists to be more inclusive and interconnected. And so field courses, we say, can stimulate learning with diverse and wide-reaching impacts. And we're going to show you some examples. These courses can train students to test hypotheses in the field, but they can also branch out even further and train students as global and interdisciplinary citizens and to use science to reach communities and solve problems. And so here we relate the design of tropical field courses to these fractal trees. These courses have evolved and diversified in recent decades, and they have to continue to do so if we're going to continue to address the problems and questions of the future. And so with this image, we'd like to share a representation of the evolutionary tree of field courses, starting at these buttress roots. And so training in tropical ecology probably started with historical natural history expeditions and fieldwork expeditions more recently as well. And when students went to the field with their professors as assistants, they learned as apprentices through observation and absorption. And then organizations like Smithsonian, OTS, different universities began formalizing field education. And there was rigorous training in developing and testing hypotheses. Invited professors came and carried out field problems as 1 to 7 day experiments that sometimes were able to produce scientific papers. These courses generally were very focused on comparing ecosystems across the famous Holdridge life zones. Then courses started to add interdisciplinarity and integration. They connected the ecology of the forest islands and the field stations to more complex human issues and interactions, and recognized the value of including host country trainees and trainers, and also developed more active frameworks for students to ask themselves, who am I in all of this? And where do I want to take this in my career? Some self-efficacy. Today, we're getting more ripe fruit on the tree, and the collaborations with stakeholders, Indigenous and underrepresented groups from both the host and visitor nations. There's more focus on interdisciplinary skills and teams, tools for communicating science, reaching audiences outside of those that only read scientific papers. And then another way to think about all of this together is that courses are becoming more functional, not only for organisms and ecosystems, but also for society and conservation. And so to put all these ideas together, we would like to suggest that the most fruitful and stimulating courses avoid being too focused on ecological fundamentals like this first tree on the left, or too focused on novel competencies like the one on the right, but instead balance the foundation and hypothesis testing with inclusive engagement and integration, like this colorful tree here in the middle.
And along that, one of the things that is really important is that there is now, the good thing about it is that not only has these ideas have been based on anecdotal information or just experiences from students' feedback or just our own appreciations, it also has been documented by like researchers that the fact that real hands experience and true collaboration and community building are like a really important aspect of field courses. Many students have like show and like several surveys have demonstrated that the students' self-confidence, both in personal growth and scientific skills, have like been enhanced by this group, by these courses. And the same thing with influencing their careers. Students learn a global perspective by going somewhere else if it's not a field course within their own same environment. And the one thing that is really important is that being open to these field opportunities and increasing the opportunities for students of all backgrounds is increasing the rotation rate and reduces the demographic gap in different science programs in different universities. So based on that, and based on this tree diagram that Jenny described for how we really want to accomplish and like a much more, sense of like interdisciplinarity and so how we maintain our science-based content and competences, but we provide opportunities for students that are collaborative, inclusive, creative, and engaged communities. So based on that, we're going to provide some examples. And actually, at this point, we're going to give the voice to our students who have contributed with some of this of their own experiences.
Hi, my name is Mekdes, and I studied abroad in Peru in 2011, and that trip completely changed my life. It was the first time I had ever left the country and applied for a passport, and we did so many amazing things on the trip, and I learned so much, but the thing that stuck with me almost 10 years later was the appreciation for the biodiversity of species. Being able to travel to the cloud forest and the rainforest and see the dense richness of life that I'd never experienced in Seattle was mind-blowing, and it changed me forever. We were able to go birding. I was able to, collect insects and capture them and study them and release them into the wild. We were empowered to run our own research, where I decided to study galls and the symbiotic relationship between plants and insects, and that was so cool to me and something I would never normally be able to do. And so it really just sparked this curiosity that I carry with me everywhere I go. Even in the city, I can appreciate the diversity of life right here.
And then we're going to give the voice to another student.
So the study abroad course I did with Ursula back in 2015, I think that was one of the most life-changing experiences in my life. And I say that mostly because it made me more determined to pursue a career in ecology. Every day throughout the course, I was able to learn different research techniques, working with different organisms. For example, I learned how to set up camera traps to work with mammals. I also learned how to set up light traps to work with insects. But for me, I became interested in birds the most. And I became very specialized in birds afterwards. Right now, I'm doing my PhD studying mixed species flocks. I would never picture myself doing any of this if it weren't for this trip. So if you have an interest in
and I will go one more in these examples.
Hello everyone, my name is Kramer Knupp, and I was a student in Ursula's Exploration Seminar to Peru course in 2014. In 2015, I was one of the teacher's assistants, and in 2016, I worked as the co-instructor for the course supporting Ursula in teaching the classes. This was hands down the most fun, beneficial course learning experience that I've ever had throughout my entire life, all the way from kindergarten throughout college. And I think that many of my peers would feel similarly. Personally, it helped broaden my global awareness as to how our lifestyles here in America are impacting ecosystems and cultures around the world. And professionally, it helped me develop the confidence and skills needed to effectively lead volunteers, crews, and fellow employees in managing habitat restoration projects here in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you.
So you can see some really excellent examples of like what people have experienced. And I bet many of you who have been doing this, they have similar things. Another thing that we want to share is some of like the outcomes of like both Jenny's and I's programs in different institutions, what we've been able to accomplish with the student, or actually what our students have been able to accomplish. While we really keep the focus on like research-based and science, we also have opportunities for students to go a little bit beyond the class. So we have student Daniel Parker, who was able to work with the late Dr. John Edwards and discovering some species of mosquitoes very early on undergrad. And now he was able to publish that. And then now he's a professor at University, in Irvine, California, and he's an expert on malaria. He's working like different places in the tropics. Another thing that is really interesting thing to do is to how this knowledge and the interactions with the environment provides them opportunities for them to actually learn with people in the field that are from there, and also the local applications of understanding ecological systems. So this is a group of students of Coresi in Costa Rica, and what they're doing is learning from a faculty invited faculty expert in entomology and also from farmers who live in the surroundings, and they can learn about the impacts of having forests near the farmers, that actually that will increase the pollination rates of the crops, and that can help in their life, in their daily life. Here's another group of students in Peru, a mix of students from a project Dragonfly from Miami University of Ohio, and SECOT, an organization that I'm working with, in which Peruvian students and international students were collecting data for a long-term project in the locality, assessing the diversity and communities of birds. Other really interesting things come out of this courses. So here we have students that are using the knowledge they gain in these ecosystems, and then putting it to things like, for example, videos and documentaries, things that they can get trained and then use this information to much wider audiences. You already, some of you may have participated in that seminar that was offered to. So video skills, editing, and then presenting these videos to communities. This is another example for a student from the University of Washington who came to Peru, and he was doing an evaluation of the diversity of fig trees, and he was climbing up this tree, and they ended up doing a project in which he actually illustrated all the different elements that he found in this mini ecosystems, these cathedrals of light that we many learned from tropical nature. So other things like, maybe Jenny, do you want to comment on this really quick?
Sure. So another thing that both Ursula and I have incorporated in our courses is that students contribute blog posts, and the benefits our blog posts include that they push students to process what they're experiencing. And so it's a little bit second level thought there. And then also have to practice engaging with wider audiences while they're going through that thought process. And it's pretty easy to set up the blog. And so that's a great way to add a level there. And then also I would say, since about 2013 or so, and I have to acknowledge leadership from Dr. Jane Zelikova here as well, we started incorporating formal modules in science communication in the OTS graduate courses. And so we replaced one or two field problems that traditionally we invited scientists, and instead we invited professional media producers like the ones that appear here and some others. And so these biology grad students spend 2 to 5 days telling stories about science through podcasts and videos. And they learn how to storyboard the pieces, use the equipment to record, and use software to edit the video and audio. And they're totally independently produced, and it's amazing what they can do with that amount of creativity. We're just going to give you a snippet, but there's a website here.
This is
by insects and by other organisms. No macroorganism exists in nature without a huge consortia of microorganisms. This is almost a Renaissance era for microbial ecology.
So just a great example of what our students have accomplished. Other things that what Jenny and I have been involved in is to give opportunities for taking our students somewhere else in the world, in this case, Costa Rica and Peru, and then also integrating them with like local students. A great interaction of that happened for our students from the University of Washington is to interact with Wallace Fellows. So those are Peruvian students funded by Cochucachu and San Diego Global, and they give an opportunity for us to interact in discussions, field activities, and also get training from both of our local scientists. Here is Dr. Roxana Arauco giving a talk about ants in Cochucachu to both of our group of students. So given that opportunity, not only getting instructor from us, but other faculty in the place, and then interacting with the students. And something really cool.
And similarly to interacting with local high impact players, we can give students opportunities during these field courses, especially at the bigger field stations, to have interactions as personal time with some of the high impact players in the field. And these are things that can happen by chance, just by going for lunch, but can also be sought out intentionally as part of the course design. And these experiences can really inspire students to do great things with their own careers and think big. Similarly, if we go to the next slide, I think it's also very inspiring for students to connect during these courses with local community leaders. And so one example from Costa Rica, we partnered with local conservation NGOs, Gente, Fauna, and NAI. And we have the students participate in community surveys and focal groups with local decision makers so that students can practice applying science to real issues. And I think
So I have a great example of like what's going on in Cochucachu and the effort of people, the staff in there in San Diego Global, the fact that Machiginga communities who are crucial for like, you know, the functionality of the national park and also highly impacted by the activities in Manu National Park, they have a role in managing some aspects about, you know, conservation, but also have a role in providing opportunities, learning opportunities for our students, not only as resource people at many aspects in the station, but at the same time, transferring knowledge, that traditional ecological knowledge and cultural knowledge that is really important for our students to understand, especially for the human roles of people in the forest. Here is a couple of the quick examples in which our students interact with people whose life and livelihood depends of activities that are sustainable or that are impacted by environmental problems such as deforestation in this case in the Madre de Dios, and sustainable activities that are small scale and that are being guided by ecological knowledge. And then corn producers, for example, in the Andes, or agriculture farmers that are being highly impacted by water issues and climate change. So really it brings us an opportunity to like combine a lot of things, and along those things too is like the capacity building for local students, providing opportunities for students like us, right, in my particular case, to just kind of learn more and then get into contribution with the field, in particular empowering opportunities for those who have been like a little bit left behind, like women, getting more women into science, getting more opportunities for women and girls, learning with girls, providing educational opportunities, and building local capacity that are really like people very well trained, give us an opportunity to enhance the impact of these courses. So I'll give you really quick a couple of examples of some of our students. So here she can speak for herself.
Hi, my name is Romina Najarro. I am a Peruvian biologist. I have been a TA for Ursula and her colleagues in different seminars and courses in the tropical Andes and the Amazon rainforest. And I learned a lot because with Ursula, it was the first time for me to go to such a natural area as Manu National Park in the rainforest. It was amazing because it's full of biodiversity, and I learned a lot from the people of different backgrounds that went there. Not only students from the course that were Americans, but also from the native people that were working on the station we went. It was amazing. And that inspired me to pursue studies on wild species, particularly in ecology and behavior. And another thing that I value a lot is that together with different backgrounds, we could compare environmental problems that happen here in Peru, but also in the States. Obviously, the situations are different, but it's interesting to compare the factors and the actors involved in these conservation problems.
And then we have Diego. Jenny, you want to say something about Diego?
Sure. So Diego is a student that both Ursula and I were lucky enough to share a long time ago. First, he did a course with Ursula in Peru, and then later a graduate course with me in Costa Rica. And now he's a graduate student. So we'll let him talk.
Oh, no. Here, Diego.
Hello, my name is Diego Garcia. I am a PhD student at the University of Florida. I've had the privilege of attending to these field courses in the past. And one of the things that I recall the most, besides of course the quality of the instructors, was an amazing group of students that were attending to these courses. Students from different countries and different backgrounds. Their personal experience enriched these courses in a way beyond my expectations.
And one more, capacity building.
My name is Janelle Peña Jimenez, and I was an OTS member in the summer of 2016. I currently work at the Zoology Museum of my institution, which is the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. I was able to learn a lot about ecology and how to do a lot of science communication. And I was able to land a job here working with kids, and I do also modeling for our visits, so I can see if we're receiving more or less students. So I've been able to use art programming for our visitors, mostly thanks to all that I learned in OTS.
So great. And we have one more video. Jenny?
So Jim is a professor that I've worked with on a field course here in Costa Rica, and he has lots of experience. And so I asked him to share his thoughts on the benefits of inviting local faculty to field courses.
Hi, I'm Jim Martin. I'm a professor of biology at Penn State University. Since 1993, I've been teaching tropical field ecology throughout, collaborated with Costa Rican professors. Initially ones who were grad students and postdocs at Penn State, and for the last 20 years, a couple of different Universidad Nacional professors who've been absolutely fantastic, and they've become two of my greatest friends in life. More importantly, they're a huge asset for the course. The students love interacting with them. Their local knowledge, their cultural knowledge, their historical knowledge, their ability to explain the context, to do simple things like identifying what's that agricultural practice we just passed in the bus. Things that I can't touch, they know all sorts of things about. Their presence relieves me of all kinds of logistical planning details, as well as having to be the person who knows everything and has to answer every question, because I don't know everything, and they can pretty soon tell you're faking if you pretend you know everything. So this has been a fantastic experience, and I highly recommend working with local scientists.
Great. So see, I mean, we could continue talking more, but we have like so much short time. But this is just these are just few examples of some of the different things that we have incorporated in our courses. So what it comes for the future? Obviously, we want to kind of maintain the strong science-based courses that are inclusive, intercultural, interdisciplinary, and creative, and kind of work in a system that integrates all, to apply this knowledge into local issues, invite local experts and people and different resources, resource people, students, and all the different opportunities. Connect with local communities. It's a really important aspect. And then how we integrate all that local knowledge, the course and the projects into like a very much and a fulfilling experience. So just, again, just to give you a sense of what we've been working on and the challenges we have. And Jenny?
Okay, so thank you. Both of us would like to thank you so much for taking the time to hear our talk. We leave you here with some questions. I'm not going to read through them, but they're here for you to think about, and we hope continue the conversation within your circles as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Ursula. That was really amazing. And thanks for sharing all these insights with us. If the attendees have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button. We will address the questions for Jenny and Ursula at the end of our Q&A session. So now we'll move to the next talk by Suzanne Macy. It's my great pleasure to introduce her. She is a biodiversity scientist at the American Museum of Natural History and a lecturer at Columbia University in New York. Her work focuses on the intersection of ecology and conservation, and as the program manager of the Network for Conservation Educators and Practitioners, NCEP, Suzanne leads the editorial processes for an online collection of biodiversity conservation teaching materials, and that includes the online publication, Lessons in Conservation. Suzanne participates in education research programs and leads professional development events for conservation educators. And with that, I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Anne. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me try that one more time because it did not. Okay. All right, thank you. As Anne mentioned, my name is Suzanne Macy and I'm the program manager for NCEP. I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, New York, and I'm on the unceded land of the Lenape people. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous peoples of your location, both past, present, and future generations. And I'd like to just start by thanking the past presenters and mention that I too probably had my career path set in front of me because a tropical ecology course I took in Costa Rica. And if you want to see a 19-year-old Suzanne Macy talking about the rainforest, go to conservenature.org and see some of the media that we produced from that way back when. It's pretty fun to reflect on that. And it definitely did get me set in this direction of working as a conservation biologist, not in tropical systems, so that's okay, and looking to improve conservation education. So similar to what Ursula and Jenny mentioned about capacity building, NCEP, the Network of Conservation Educators and Practitioners, is a capacity development program of my department, the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History. And so there's many things that we do in this program, but one of which is run these conservation teaching and learning studios. And so this is an opportunity to bring educators, researchers, practitioners from all over the world together and to talk about improving conservation education. And we have programs with specific partner countries sometimes. For example, we had a decade-long project in Peru and Bolivia. And the work that we did through that project is highlighted in a book chapter of tropical conservation. And it covers some of the best practices we found from that experience. So by capacity development, we mean actually helping folks do the work they need to do. So that could be providing resources, training, it could be collaborations. And the work that we did in Bolivia and Peru really looked at the train the trainer approach. And so after these educators and scientists worked together, then they would return to their home institutions to share what they learned and improve their practices. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the results of that particular project. I do have this infographic here. You will get access to these slides in the future. You can take a closer look, or you can look at the actual book chapter. But NCEP goes by REPC down in Bolivia and Peru. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about these studio events that we have. But more specifically, I'm going to give you an insight into what a studio event would include. We also have these events in the US. This year was our first year doing it all virtually. And so some of the insights from doing a virtual class will also be embedded in this presentation. So we're going to start off with a little thought experiment. So in the US, there is an old adage, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So I want you to put on your scientist cap or your researcher hat, and I want you to think about how you would design a study to test this hypothesis. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do that, and I'm not going to talk. All right, so that's been around 30 seconds. So now as a teacher on an online class, I could ask you to share what your thoughts are on this. You could put it into the chat box perhaps. We could have a breakout session where we discuss what each individual student's actual experiment was going to be. But for the sake of time, in this format of a webinar, we're going to move forward. And so in this class, then I could say, okay, well, this experiment actually happened, and here are some of the results of it. And this is just a fake example, but I want you now to take that researcher hat off and put on your teacher hat and think about, if you were teaching this material, how would you teach about these results? And I'm going to give you again a couple of seconds to really think about how you would teach about this. So pausing and having silence is a little painful, especially in an online scenario like this. But I wanted to do it to show you best practices, because you have, if you ask a student to do something in your course, you have to give them the time, the quiet time to think about it and be thoughtful about what their response would be, and to proceed with the actual experiment or whatever activity you're doing. So now you've had some time to think about how you might teach the results of this scientific study. And again, I could have an opportunity for us to discuss what you thought. But in reality, what I want you to do now is just reflect. Which thought experiment did you enjoy better? Did you feel more comfortable thinking as a researcher, trying to actually design the study? Or did you feel more comfortable as an educator, trying to think about how you would design a class session about the study? And from past studio participants, I can say that generally people, scientists and researchers, are more excited about thinking about the research rather than the teaching. And so there's a whole book about the idea of scientific teaching and how we can, as scientists and researchers, apply those frameworks and ideas to the teaching. So you might have heard of scientific teaching in the past. Other things could include classroom assessment or action learning or research-led teaching. There's a lot of different terms out there. But basically what in this case is that you're going to try to wear multiple hats. You can still think in the same way as a scientist does, but applying that to your teaching. And so that could include things like being rigorous about your teaching, making decisions based on the evidence, evaluating your results, thinking critically about what knowledge you should share and what the students should be doing. How will you know that they were able to get to that goal? And how will they know that they were able to get to that goal. Just like science, you can be creative. You have to be aware of the different options and methods that are out there. It also can be very collaborative, discussing ideas of your teaching within the community of teachers. And we encourage you to experiment, just like you do in science. Try new things, looking for ways to advance your skills, and testing your assumptions about learning and teaching. So talking about assumptions, another thing that we might do now to make this lecture a little interactive is to have a prompt for students or participants to actually think about their assumptions. So I might give you 2 minutes to reflect on this question. What are at least 2 assumptions you might have about teaching and learning, and create if-then statements. And then it could be some sort of interaction between in a breakout room that talks about this, or you might decide to have an actual partner that throughout the course of the semester, student has a partner that they chat in the Zoom box, a private chat, and they respond to each other on specific prompts like this, and sort of have a digital version of a think, pair, share. We're not going to do that today, but it's just to show an example of how you can make a lecture a little bit more interactive. But going back to the topic of student learning, you can actually, as an educator, investigate and evaluate your students' learning, just like you do in science with evaluating assumptions and tests. Now, a lot of you are field researchers probably, and so you might be more familiar with a field researcher doing some measuring. So here's just another example of that. There's a bunch of different literature out there about learning and how we learn and what are sort of different dimensions of learning. And one of them is the Think Significant Learning taxonomy. And so basically, you know, when you're designing a course, you want to think about what are the goals of this course. And you can think about what dimensions of learning do I want my students to come out of with this course. So this could be learning how to learn. This could be about the actual knowledge of the field, the foundational knowledge, or how you apply that in something like a data analysis or a project, how it integrates with other fields, human dimensions. And all of these things are really nicely described on DFINC's website. You could Google this, but there's also papers that show how to do this in an e-learning setting as well. I have a citation at the bottom that you can look at later. Just to break that down a little bit, that was a lot of information, and I'm not going to be able to really bring you through all of these dimensions. But basically, as an educator, you can decide what is it that I want my students to get out of this course, whether it be the skills of tropical ecology. Well, it might be, as Ursula and Jenny mentioned, getting new perspectives, understanding the local people in that area, or it could be learning about oneself and what you, the student, wants to do with their lives. Understanding other people's values and interests, for example. And so at this moment, in an interactive classroom, I might have you have a reflection moment where I want you to think about these different dimensions of teaching and which one of these sort of dimensions you think would be the easiest or the hardest. And there's ways that I could solicit your responses. For example, I could use software platforms like Poll Everywhere. I could use the Zoom poll option, or I could use Google Forms, or even ask you to put your result of this reflection into the chat box. So back to the main topic of scientific teaching. There's sort of a framework that has 3 questions to help guide you through it. It's what do I want students to know, understand, and be able to do? What is the best way to get there? And how will I know I did? So these questions are very vague, and they could be applied to any course, not just a tropical ecology course or not just an intro biology course. And there are approaches that are standardized basically for these 3 questions. So what your students want to know and understand, those are your goals and objectives. The way to get there is through activities, and you'll know they got there by doing assessment. And then we can sort of reorder these into 3 steps of scientific teaching. So the first step being the charting the goals and objectives. Then you plan how you're going to be able to know they hit those goals and objectives. So planning your assessment. And then you design activities that actually help them practice those skills and understanding that knowledge to be able to succeed on those assessments. This can be broadened. We do this often for when we're teaching about scientific course design, where we add a fifth step, which is to integrate. So it's thinking about all of those things and how do they work within an individual class session? How do they work between class sessions? How do they work within the whole course? How do they work within the curriculum in your department, et cetera. But then we also add the first component, which is the first step, which is defining the context. And this includes things like understanding where the students are coming from, where you're coming from, understanding the context of your field and what's important in that regard, your university, or the context like it's a COVID year and you're unable to normally do what you're going to do, and the context has changed and now it's an online course, for example. How does that shift your course design? So what I'm going to focus on for the remainder of my talk, though, is really this fourth point, which is designing active and aligned learning. That the first point that I just mentioned, defining the context, really included in that is inclusive teaching and having that as a grounding for the rest of your course. And I would love to spend this entire time just talking about inclusive teaching, but I'm going to focus on the active learning at this point. But there is research out there that shows that inclusive teaching includes active learning, and active learning actually provides a more inclusive environment and opportunities for underrepresented folks to succeed in a course climate. So zooming out a little bit to ground our designing of our activities through our understanding of learning and the evidence that's out there, we know that students are not empty vessels to be filled with knowledge. They have pre-existing knowledge and they construct knowledge based on top of that. And so to try to engage students with what they already know, you might have them do a pre-course survey or an in-class survey. You might have a question of the day at the beginning of class, engaging their existing knowledge on the topic before you then talk about it and work through it in the class. And then if you collect the responses of these sort of questions or these surveys, then you can actually look at them and respond dynamically to what your students actually know or understand about the system, and then it can adapt and change how you teach. So that is just one first point about learning. Another point about learning is that students need clear guidance and structure to construct their knowledge, and this is also a good part of inclusive teaching, making sure expectations are well known. So that means setting clear learning objectives and providing that scaffold. Also, students should be thinking about their learning. It's called metacognition. They should monitor their own learning. So giving opportunities for students to reflect on their learning, also opportunities for you to give feedback or them to give feedback on their learning can help advance their skills and that learning how to learn aspect of learning. And lastly, students should be active participants. And so you should create, as a teacher, you should create participatory and collaborative environments. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on, that active teaching side of things for the remainder. So it's not really about what the teacher's doing up on the screen or in front of the classroom. Active teaching doesn't mean that you as a teacher are super active. It instead means what the students are doing. The students are actively constructing knowledge. So this picture here can sometimes instill panic in teachers. There's a lot of students, a lot going on, and not even just in COVID times, which obviously now it's even more so a panic situation seeing all of these people together. But this is actually a great environment for students to actually construct knowledge. And so it can be a little overwhelming when you're starting in this sort of context, but with practice, both on your part and the students getting used to how these sort of active moments are structured and what's expected of them, starts becoming normal and they get used to it and it can really help them. So again, to some, it's not the teacher-centered, what is the teacher doing? It's really shifting focus to what the student is doing, which is called learner-centered teaching. And that could be activities like debates or role plays. It could be discussions. It could be case studies, student presentations, field exercises. We just saw a great presentation that showed that's like the extreme best case scenario of active teaching is having students do the actual work, create, be immersed in it. And, but again, this particular presentation sort of is helping you to think about other possibilities outside of that, if specifically you can't do a field project at this point. Even simple things like breakout rooms or discussion groups or discussion boards, to have that interaction can be helpful for your students and their learning. So I want to mention that there's lots of resources out there to help you design what these active moments are that are based in the evidence of what works. One book I want to recommend is this Collaborative Learning Techniques. And it has about 35 different techniques, sort of like a recipe book for you to try to use in your classroom. And in the second edition, they've included online variants. So that can be really helpful if you're designing an online course for first time. But what about traditional lectures? If focusing on these active teaching moments and activities, that doesn't mean that lectures are out of the question. This right here is a lecture, what I'm giving to you. This can be when we are presenting new discoveries or new developments or perspectives. It could be when you're giving an overview of a topic or synthesizing across a diverse set of information that your students might not have access to or might not be able to research. Just a little note though, if you are creating recorded lectures that you're going to post online for your students, the science of teaching and learning actually has done, it's just starting in this online learning world really, but it shows that videos that are over 6 minutes and long, you tend to reduce engagement of students. And so think of your lectures as mini lectures. And yes, you can have many mini lectures if you need to cover a lot, but put them into bite-sized chunks so students can process them and don't lose off or fall off the engagement and you lose them. So interactions in themselves can be interactive. And so I've explained some ideas for things like think, pair, share. There's another one called pass the chalk. Again, this would be in person where you would ask a question and then students could pass a piece of chalk or whatever that might be and pass the question on to someone else. In the digital version, you might hear that being called popcorn, where students call on each other based on the Zoom screen and who they see. It could be something as simple as asking students to define a term in 140 characters as if they were writing a tweet about it or something along those. So engaging them briefly as little stopping points within your lecture to actually activate them. So to give you a little overview of how this might look in practice, the same folks who wrote Scientific Teaching, the book that I showed in the beginning, actually did a survey of folks who were actively using scientific teaching in their classroom and said, what does your 50-minute period of class time look like? And so I'm going to zoom in on this little clock diagram. And basically they came up with a recipe of what has been done, where you start off a class with a brainstorming session, engaging pre-existing knowledge, getting students ready and active to learn. You might have a mini lecture. Then you might actually have a activity that is geared towards a specific skill that you are hoping to get out of the students to get out of this course, for example, data interpretation or analysis. You might then have a lecture that goes in deeper into the topic. Then you might want to make sure students have an opportunity to discuss and learn from different perspectives. So you might have them read a short case study and then talk amongst themselves. Then you might pose a question that sort of summarizes that idea and do a think, pair, share. You could end your session with a short mini lecture that summarizes or maybe brings in new information from the literature that has yet to be mentioned in the course. And then you can have a 1-minute paper, which is a short reflection prompt that has students think about, whether it be thinking about their learning and how they understood something or what they can do to help improve their understanding, or it could be something on the content if you really wanted to make sure that they understand a specific concept. Another idea is doing something called the muddiest point, where you ask students to say, after this session, what is the one thing that you're really not sure about? You can have them submit that digitally, or if you're in person on a piece of paper or an index card, then you can use that for your next class. And so you're prepared to address some of the issues or the misconceptions that might have come up in the past class, and maybe having that brainstorming session in the beginning be dedicated to that. So when you're trying to decide what should be lecture, what should be interactive, it's important for you to think about when do you want your students to be doing something towards their mastery of a skill, or you want them to really reflect on the connections that have been made. And then you have to think about when is it time for you to step up and provide maybe that structure, that scaffolding, that information that helps them through that process. And I only have a couple minutes left. I just want to mention that, in addition to doing teacher trainings, which NCEP does, we also can do some educational research. One example was a few years back, we did a project that looked at advancing student skills within one semester. So here's just an example of what we did, putting that scientist hat on in the classroom. We had students perform a critical thinking exercise in the beginning of their course. And then we assessed that via a rubric. And then this was done with classrooms across the US and in Puerto Rico. And we had, then some of those classes had an intervention where they had an additional exercise where the students actually used the rubric to evaluate a fake student's exercise that was a little bit different than the one they had done. And the other group of students did not have this intervention. And then at the end of the course, there was a secondary critical thinking exercise, this one, for example, on invasive species. So the content is still in it in these exercises, but the skill of critical thinking was also another skill we wanted to get out of this experience. And then students did this exercise too, and there's a rubric. And so when comparing for those who had the intervention or not, students who had that intervention where they got to reflect on what it means to do critical thinking and reflect on their performance as well of the exercise. There was a 34% improvement in critical thinking. We also did it for other skills like data analysis and oral communication. And so those exercises and the example interventions is available on our website, ncep.aimnh.org. This website has a collection of over 170 educational modules on all sorts of topics in conservation and biodiversity. There were about, I think, 25 of these modules that are online were actually created by our partners in Peru and Bolivia. And we also have worked on ground with partners and doing these sort of studio events for over a decade in Madagascar, in Vietnam, in Mongolia, in Mexico, Cuba. So there's a bunch of different resources that also adapted to the local context, which we found was very important to have. There's 32 in Spanish and 28 in French and some other languages as well. So I'm just gonna wrap up to say that although I wasn't able to go into all of the studies that supported a lot of the ideas I talked about, there will be a slide at the end of this PowerPoint that when you can download it, the PDF on the ATBC website once it's posted, and it has all the references, and it has a bunch of references that support this statement, which is active teaching can improve student learning, attitudes, performance, and retention in STEM fields. And I should note that is more so the case for underrepresented students. And so the sort of idea of the studio approach is that hopefully you'll take some information from here and you can apply it to your own teaching. We recognize that it is hard to take on all of these different things at once. And so we encourage you to take small steps. Think of one simple activity that you could add to your classroom to make it more interactive, practice it, have your students become comfortable, and then you can slowly add additional activities to make your classroom more and more interactive. So what I would normally do at the end of an interactive lecture like this is actually have you reflect on a prompt. There are resources for online learning like onlinequestions.org or Padlet where students could respond to prompts like this. They could upvote them. And again, you as a teacher could then look at that and decide how it's going to inform your teaching for the next day. So thank you. I'll pass it back to Anna Mitch.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was wonderful. You have me really thinking about many things, given that I'm in the process of changing my course to an online course, and there's a lot to think about. I'll definitely download the resources that you sent, but what I really would like to do is bring you to Puerto Rico, because there's a lot of our professors that could really benefit from having a workshop like this. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
We have worked with folks in Puerto Rico before, but yes, we'll talk more about it.
Okay. Well, now we'll move on to our last speaker, which is Rebecca Harden. Rebecca is an associate professor at the University of Michigan. She's an environmental anthropologist who has worked in Africa, and her work is focused on historically marginalized groups in conservation and education processes. What she's here to talk to us today is about GALA. And I would really encourage all of you, after the talk or after this webinar, to take a look at GALA. Like I said, I'm starting a new course and having to give it online, and GALA and the case studies within GALA have been an incredible resource. So I'm not going to say any more. I will leave it up to Rebecca, and she can tell us all the details. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mitch. I hardly need say more. That was a terrific endorsement, and from someone who is teaching and doing research really at the cutting edge of what it means to learn and understand something as complex as a tropical ecosystem. I think that it's been our privilege as a team at GALA to work with some of the materials that you've brought to the platform. More about that a little bit later, but I want to share my screen with you all and first give you just a little bit of a backstory about my journey to curricular innovation and collaboration with tropical ecologists as an anthropologist. I will start by emulating my colleague Suzanne with a land acknowledgement, which is I've put simply acknowledgement, because actually these statements at the start of a presentation cannot any longer be seen only as a land acknowledgement. They are acknowledgements of the remarkably complex and violent relationships between the ways that formal universities learn and teach and the ways that many other human institutions have worked for learning and teaching over time. I have been really lucky to be last in this string of talks because it gives me all sorts of opportunities to braid together what my co-panelists have said. And I would say that in some ways, as an anthropologist, if you go back to the start of field learning, it is actually very deep in human history. It is linked with initiation rituals for young people becoming adults who move into the natural world away from their communities and towns for a period of time. I think the roots of field education and engaged learning go very deep in human history indeed. And so we'd be remiss not to acknowledge the violence that the building of formal educational institutions in this young country did to complex knowledge systems of the peoples like the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and others. Wyandot lands were ceded as well in coercive historical treaties, which not only gave us the original land on which even those of us on Zoom today would not be here were it not for those lands, but also alienated in many ways young people from the educations that they deserved. And there's an enormous amount of work going on right now on our campus. This is a working draft, and there are many, many smart people at the University of Michigan in dialogue with one another and with tribal partners, communities across the state of Michigan, to do better and better all the time at the ways we talk and think about these issues. I raise them because I think they're fundamentally important for the question we all have as educators today, which is how do we do better in our work as educators on these kinds of challenges, right? My own work as a researcher in cultural ecology and human ecology began with a dissertation in the Southwest Central African Republic, where I had been a Peace Corps volunteer and did not feel my learning nor my work was done. I worked in a place called the Zanga-Sanga Dense Forest Reserve that is connected with other protected areas across the boundaries of Cameroon and Northern Congo. And I looked at the ways in which, in particular, peoples with legacies of forest foraging and employment histories with industries like trophy hunting were adapting to increasing levels of extractive industry, but also formal conservation economies with ecotourism and so forth. My subsequent work continued and deepened in the Central African Republic. I collaborated with primatologists and other scholars doing what I think could best be called cross-subfield work in anthropology between biological and cultural anthropology. And so I have a soft spot for those learning processes, even within a field or between fields, that ask us to really grapple with one another's ways of knowing different differently a same landscape or a same group of people. And we've been perpetually trying to go beyond the notion that locals or local communities are a backdrop to our work, but rather, as many of the panelists today have discussed, ensuring that our ethics of engaged learning also entail privileging those partners and exploring the parameters of their historical marginalization from landscapes. Later work was in South Africa for me. There are also communities, but much more elite communities of wealthy, traditionally governed groups who control mining resources within South Africa. And I became really interested in notions of public sector, private sector partnerships, and the ways, but still always the ways that traditional learning and knowledge and politics were in complicated relationships with what we think of as, quote, modern ones, right? So universities, governments, states, and corporations. This is continuing to be an interest of mine, and it has indeed spilled over into my first experience teaching a field course, which was only in 2010, which seems relatively recent in the span of a midlife career. For a couple of years, I worked with colleagues here at the University of Michigan to teach social and natural science field courses in Kenya at the Impala Research Center in Laikipia, Kenya, which is a really remarkable ecosystem, and it's a really wonderful institution for doing field ecological research. It is in a region of Kenya in which there are quite a few complex relationships, not the least of which is the renting of land by the British military for training operations. And I think many of us who engage in field and engaged learning opportunities have sort of had to make an abstraction of these political economic backdrops to our work in order to make sure we are carefully focusing in on precisely the things Suzanne mentioned, which is what is it we've come here to learn and show our students. But I want to also raise the question of how around the edges of a really good course can we have conversations about the landscapes we're working in, both institutionally and ecologically, better and with more and more confidence, because they do shape the conditions on which we can bring in local partners as genuine collaborators. This is a photo of my daughter with a British soldier on a break from our field course activities. And it just goes to show that the things that we think about as being in the background often are factors that influence the nature and parameters of our partnership activities at times. This has become all the more clear to me as I moved from McGill University in Canada, where I continue ties with Cicada, a program that you heard about earlier in the webinar today, into the United States, into a school, the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, which is historically known for its environmental justice programs. And in that move, I began to work more in relation to blight, water crises, and energy politics within the upper Midwest of the United States. And I began to learn more and more about innovations, theoretical and research structure innovations, but also educational innovation that is addressing those inequities in our landscapes where we work and live. And I began to rethink my work in Africa. I began to build less sort of expeditions for ethnographic research and more reciprocal research partnerships that connect communities in Michigan, like Flint or Detroit, with those communities in Africa, like Libreville, Gabon, for example, in this photograph, where people are trying to solve the same problems, like, for example, trust in water quality or pressure on fragile wildlife populations who in turn are ravaging plantations and agriculture. So I began to develop tools for teaching about wolf hunting in Michigan to African people grappling with elephant management, or tools for thinking about water quality in Gabon to communities in Detroit who are also having water quality issues. Ultimately, I believe many of the ecological and sustainability challenges we face today are, as Suzanne's work has shown, and as our previous, all of us, Ursula, Jenny, we are all working against the science deficit model in which we somehow in a North American institutional setting have science we have to share or diffuse to others. We know that's outmoded. We know that in fact, many, many places in the world share common challenges, and we must find ways to build bridges and partnerships towards solutions. Now in Gabon, I have found an amazing gift, which is the fact that the place is itself home to iconic institutions in which you see both enormous strides, like the Nobel Prize winning Schweitzer Hospital, where care for the poor and for the environment has been quite famously defended by Albert Schweitzer himself and by generations of Gabonese and others who revere that place and its legacies. But they are places that need decolonizing as well. And they are places that allow a rich terrain for the kinds of field schools that, say, the Smithsonian Institution has begun to run. I am deeply indebted to colleagues at the University of New Orleans in Louisiana and the Science and Technical University in Gabon, in Franceville, of Masuku, who have created really wonderful partnerships to bring students together from Gabon and the US in field ecological work that acknowledges these colonial legacies and begins very carefully to undo and rebuild. So for me now, I find myself as a researcher and an educational innovator seeking tools that help enable choices in management for sustainable and just futures. Whether it's from the photograph on the left here, which you see me in a panel with Flint, Michigan residents, journalists, native leaders, and others looking at water quality issues, whether it's in Equatorial Africa, where I continue to do the work I can to listen to often non-literate experts who tell me about the condition of their water systems and their forests, to this kind of a more recent NSF-funded collaboration with civil and environmental engineers, in which people in Vermont and Michigan are beginning to explore urine diversion technologies so that we can have more efficient wastewater treatment and recover nutrients from our own urine for our agriculture in order to close loops that we have severed, and experiment with innovations that can make our food production and water management and wastewater management systems more sustainable. These projects seem very different, but they have in common a commitment to reverence for some of the historic and old perspectives on what human roles are in complex systems, and innovation in directions that restore right relations in those systems. They draw on developments in cultural ecology and anthropology about what is a community if it is not merely a small, stable social unit, but rather a common interest share, a group with shared internalized norms. This begins to move us toward definitions of communities that are not just local people, but communities of practice. Like, for example, the one you find among us as panelists today on this webinar from very different locations and institutions and backgrounds. But we are, in fact, a community. It draws on developments in sociology and political science about what does it mean to be marginalized? What does marginality mean? Even within a group that is a minority group, there can be further marginalization. How do we attend to those questions in something like a, quote, host country, where within that country, not all partners are equal, and we must acknowledge that within our own, the same is true. So that kind of nuanced thinking is becoming very, very useful. And developments in environmental justice also, in which I've begun to think about distributive justice, have shaped the place from which I came to create what Mitch calls GALA. So that was a pretty long backstory, but I was hoping to situate myself and my team a little bit for you so that when we talk about how we came to create GALA, you have some sense of where it came from. I have long been indebted to student leadership on digital innovation in sustainability education. At the University of Michigan, many of them have created bridges by using radio and digital media platforms, the kinds of podcasts you heard from Ursula and Jenny about in the first talk. Since 2008, student-produced radio, which I have supported as a faculty's champion, has created bridges between radio stations on, say, African university campuses and our own, programs in African universities and our own, looking at questions of sustainability and practice, and getting voices from across different contexts to weigh in on common challenges. This undergirded in some ways our effort to build a craft tech team that would work with local developer talent and even student developer talent to try to build the kind of tools that could capture such media, combine them with strong faculty guidance about concepts and competencies in the emerging field of sustainability science, and create a platform that would be open access and open source, but focused and immersive and easy to use, not distracting, right? Oftentimes as learners in these amazingly rapidly proliferating digital platforms, we feel overwhelmed. There's so much information. So this very diverse team you see pictured here, which is only one group photo over several years, we've taken many, But you can see colleagues in this who come from Iran, from China, from South Asia, from various walks of life within the United States. You can see the ways in which academic innovation teams at the University of Michigan have supported us and flanked us as we took a big risk, which was to use student developers and faculty and students themselves to drive the innovative features of the platform GALA. Now, you don't have to wait, as Mitch suggested, although of course it would be polite to, but even if you're on a cell phone, you could type in www.learngala.com right now and pull up the platform. I, of course, am about to pull it up as I close this formal part of the presentation and show you just one or two quick things to spark discussion. But I did want to let you know that as you look at the platform on that URL, and I do have it on later slides as well, the URL, you'll see that we have a couple of different key innovative features. One is that we are built by teams. Most of the cases are co-authored, and many are co-authored not just by students and faculty, like the classic business cases you see from Harvard, for example, but also by practitioners, by people working in problem-solving fields. We have created libraries, including the one you see on this slide, the Michigan Sustainability Cases, but we have other libraries under construction as well, one from the USDA, one from the Indian School of Business, one indeed from some of the co-authors on this call today, on this webinar. So you see a range of different partners coming together in ways that create modules, which are decision cases. They tell a story about a sustainability challenge, and they connect that story to a skill, for example, using an Excel spreadsheet or some form of geospatial data or some form perhaps of ecological data. We're getting better and better at helping students, learners, either engage in simulations or role plays, or even field data collection with a few key pointers that we provide in order to bolster the story of what they're learning about. It can be dam removal, it could be mining, it could be herding of goats. In fact, all of these are cases on our platform, but each one includes an engaged learning exercise, which does its darndest to adhere to the kinds of best practices Suzanne just laid out in her presentation. Right now, one of our frontiers is toward authentic assessment in education at primary school levels. And so one of the cases I'll show you briefly before we adjourn for a broader conversation is one that's been produced in partnership with primary schools in Michigan and shared with our collaborators at the Slate School in Connecticut, where they are starting with very, very early nature-based educational models, which I believe are a really revolutionary tide in education in our country right now, and one that is urgently needed. But the theory behind all of this comes as well from scholars of decolonization and post-coloniality, and the thinking about how the artifacts of our educational system, including something like a formal curriculum or a lecture, or even a module, if it's not done in ways that are fairly flexible and generous, can be themselves vehicles for emphasizing inequality in learning relationships. I want to point to Paraskeva's work on decolonized engaged learning, this notion of an itinerant curriculum, which is to say a curriculum that can be created beyond the norms and expectations of formal curricular demands and across communities from different locations within global systems. It's very, very important. And those are the kinds of theoretical things that underlie what we are now doing, which is forging practical partnerships between our team at the University of Michigan and many elsewhere. Of course, my favorite one right now is the one with OCELOTS, which is a network for facilitating online content for experiential learning of tropical systems. Got it? OCELOTS. I think it's a great name. And you see here an image that captures the OCELOTS acronym, which we devised, and also a reference to two of the other tools besides www.learngala.com, which have fed into this network and to this team. One is NSEP, which Suzanne and her colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History have created, a wonderful open educational resource, and also Cubes Hub, which Drew Lamar at William & Mary has been a point person for dialogue about with our team. There is an ethos here of making smarter, better, open educational resources with greater reach and specificity and success for their users. And in doing that, we found that collaborating with one another is a really, really important way for us to improve one another's efforts and protect the important space of open educational resources for engaged learning at this time. I'll stop that screen share for a moment now and just take you very briefly to the platform. I do hope that my moderators will let me know if I'm running over time. I think I have just a few minutes left, though, to show you a little bit of this particular tool before we get off and go into conversation. And I'm going to show you the two tools which actually are the ones I referenced in our slides very, very briefly, so that you have the URL in the slideshow when you access it later and can see those tools and a little bit of what Mitch was describing in terms of how a tool like this can capture immersive learning, perhaps particularly in an era of COVID when it is so difficult for us to actually go into the field and to be in an immersive field setting with our students. So here's one. This is a module that was created by students at the University of Michigan's School for Environment and Sustainability. It gets back to my land acknowledgement, quote, land acknowledgement earlier, with a notion that we need to be thinking about how even the building blocks of our curricula should do a better job of educating us about our exploitative histories and restoring right relations. This particular case, as you can read here on the front page, centers around a decolonizing framework to address land management and right relations here in Michigan. Now, if you were in the GALA catalog, you would be able to get to this case, and this is your landing page on GALA. If you type that URL in, this is what you'll find, is just kind of a menu of the various cases we feature, right? And you'll see the dots on a map as to where they've been made. We do have one in construction now from New Zealand and Australia. I know it's a blank spot on the map. You can search by themes here. Specific themes or areas, or by libraries. But I would just like to type in, for example, wild rice, because that is the plant at the center of this ecological restorative learning module. And the module has had leadership from the curator of our botanical gardens here at the University of Michigan and our Arboretum, who partnered with our students to marshal resources about Native American histories, about land grants that shaped our institution, but also about how the gardens and collections of plants in our university currently contain materials that have been alienated from the landscapes in which they were originally cultivated. And this is a really cool case because it talks a bit about how in using repatriation of human remains and the legal and justice-oriented norms that were established for that work with museums, right? Using the NAGPRA framework, we've been able to conduct here at Michigan not only repatriation of biological remains to indigenous communities, but also rematriation of seed materials like this wild rice plant you see, so that they can be planted again and indeed studied. We have experimental plots in which tribes come in and work with botanical garden staff to plant certain varieties each year. And they weigh the performance of those varieties here in Michigan land against the predictions of the USDA and others about whether they're still viable after so many years in storage and about whether they could be viable if planted again by actual agriculturalists. So there's a lot of partnership behind this module, but if you wanted to teach it in a classroom, you would then have some of the things Suzanne talked about, manageable chunks of information, very tightly linked with the media that they refer to so that it's something one can do in increments, and a set of hands-on activities that can be done, including sketching. Here's a sketch by one of the students who completed the module, but also a familiarity with current initiatives toward a decolonized or itinerant curriculum, which I think is a really wonderful thing to have. So that's one module I wanted to show you. And the second, very briefly, before we close out and move into conversation about these tools and how they're used, is this one, which is from the School of Education at the University of Michigan, which is about leveraging this notion of experiential and place-based learning in K through 12 workshops. Can teachers at the middle school or high school level use the kinds of techniques that Ursula and Ginny were talking about, the kinds of best practices in engaged learning, to better prepare students to enter fields like biology and ecology with in mind some of the complex systems that are currently operating? This is actually a case in which they the authors, who are a combination of students and School of Education staff at the University of Michigan, take you through a teacher's learning and professional development experience. And so here we're developing professional development tools for educators, in which we take a single teacher's learning and the way that he himself designed a field trip within the field. And in this case, the field is the Rust Belt city of Saginaw. It's not a beautiful tropical forest. It's a General Motors site that's been abandoned for years and is leaking toxin into the Saginaw River. No matter, the same field skills pertain as one would need, for example, in Peru or elsewhere, equatorial Africa. And I find it absolutely wonderful to think, as I mentioned earlier, across a site like this, working with a river conservancy within the Saginaw River Basin to educate children about the ecosystems in a post-industrial city is no less important than our tropical ecology work. And the two can mutually reinforce one another and strengthen one another if we have communities of practice for engaged learning at various levels. So these are the kinds of modules that you too can build if you simply take a moment and go to the question mark on the platform. You'll find all manner of tools. If you'd like to author a case because you have some video or maps or a site that you like or a story to tell, you can experiment with that. And most of what you need to do it is right here on the platform. It's as easy as making an Instagram or a Facebook post if you're familiar with social media. It doesn't take much more experience with software than that. However, the kinds of concerns about best pedagogical practice that this webinar has offered can be invaluable in making the best module from your materials as possible, and maybe bringing us something that we haven't yet learned how to do on the platform in the process. Our user community is entirely based on those who've reached out and tried something new on the platform. We do no marketing, and we are growing very slowly and incrementally as a community of practice, creating collaborations toward rich, innovative modules that bring our research and professional work on conservation and ecology to bear on the ways we teach and learn about it. I think that's probably enough said for the time being, in the sense that we do want to have some time for discussion. And I thank you all for your attention. I very much hope you'll take Mitch's advice and try GALA yourselves and ask any questions you may have in this question and answer period.
Wow, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was really amazing. And I see we do have a lot of questions. Mitch and I will kind of filter through them. Mitch, do you want to start off with one of them?
Sure, we have some questions. Let's see, are we going to start with Jenny and Ursula?
Yeah, let's do that.
One of the first question that somebody sent in is that they really like this idea and they want to help out, and they were wondering, how can they sign up as an assistant or a professor with you? The other question, there was a couple of questions related to COVID. What has your experience been? Has there been some way that you guys have, the COVID disaster has helped you adapt or modify field courses, and what's happening to funding for our field courses, given the situation that we're in?
I don't know if you want to go first.
Sure. Like the first question, thanks for the questions, first of all. The first question is how they can collaborate or participate, contact us. I think that's kind of a very simple, we cannot promise anything, but contacting us, and we'll be happy to discuss more opportunities. There are many options. The second, and I can maybe add something, and then Jenny can jump in anytime. We definitely have suffered, all my courses were canceled this year, for example. So definitely that has been a huge impact, not only on the students, also in the communities there that interact with us, and then somehow they're integrated in these courses, both the students, local faculty, collaborators in the field, and all the people who work with us. So definitely that has been a huge impact. So for particular from my side, it's been a very slow process on how to reconnect through these online platforms. We've done some webinars with some students, with some organizations. We're still in the process of trying to figure out how to incorporate more activities like remote learning possibly for our students, especially if they're in other locations. One thing that I will incorporate is the fact that it's going to take definitely more time to recover from this, as long as we cannot go to places like to Peru, for example. It's not even open. And there's some other ethical considerations that I think it's important to mention, is that, you know, coming from places that are high risk in, you know, the spread of these viruses, and it has happened before in colonization times, and we go to indigenous territories, ethically, we cannot go, even if the things will be opening, is because so many people that we interact with are highly vulnerable. So that's another ethical consideration that is affecting it. That we cannot bring, again, you know, things that have been brought in the past, and even like a flu can just happen, and it has devastation in some of the communities that we reach, especially courses that we go remote. One thing that I have done is that I have had the fortune to teach some natural courses online, and then engaging through like activities in their own backyard, or, you know, students doing activities on their own, has been able to get a little bit of that experiences, but definitely we have a long way to try to recover for this. So with that, I'll stop and pass it to Jenny.
I would agree completely. I think that it's early to say that we have solutions, and we're still getting used to the idea that everything is canceled and maybe will be for who knows how long. And so I've had a couple things canceled, and we've done the best we can. Here in Costa Rica, everything is virtual. And so very quickly we shifted gears and have been thinking about how to make engaging activities. A couple little things that I've heard of or been working on. One is that the idea of students creating a research proposal pulls up a lot of the same ideas that they could have in the field. They have to think of a hypothesis, look for the literature that supports it, and, you know, practice that kind of communication. In one of my courses, we've been using old data sets and put a little bit more of the focus on analysis and how to make good graphs to communicate ideas clearly about the results of an experiment. Unfortunately, of course, students are not the ones collecting the data, but I think that that's at least part of the experience, is that actually playing with the data and going through the troubleshooting of the analysis phase is useful. And as other panelists have mentioned, I think breakout groups and smaller groups and getting students to interact with each other is a key piece. The temptation is just to put up a list of videos that they have to watch and test them at the end, but how much are they actually getting out of that? And so I think that when we're thinking about ways to be active engagement, they can interact with each other. And another piece that I've seen used in very interesting ways is you can invite people to Zoom in the same way that we invite people to field courses. And so not only asking other professors to give a talk about something, but asking if a stakeholder in a place that you just read a case study about, you could ask a farmer from that region to Zoom with you. Most people also have technology available. And so it's better, obviously, in terms of the student experience, to go to the place and directly interact with those people. But I think that those collaborations that have been built up over the years can be useful for the sake of continuing to engage a little bit in the meantime by setting up Zoom chats during class sessions, including with people in the community. And it's challenging, of course, but I think that that's part of what this group of OCELOTS, when we're getting together, it's because we're all excited about similar ideas like this of how do we continue to use these ideas, but through electronic platforms. So hopefully we'll keep coming up with more solutions and putting our heads together. Was that all the questions, Mitch? I'm not sure.
Oh, there are a lot more questions, but I thought maybe we could do a round through everybody and come back to you guys with some more questions in a while.
Sounds great.
Suzanne, one of the things that you mentioned, but you said you didn't have enough time to expand on, and that's the idea of the challenge of creating inclusive environments. So I'd like to give you a few more minutes to expand on that and
Yeah, sure.
your ideas.
And I'm just actually going to pull up a slide because I had a slide. So with some resources, I figured might as well share now, and folks can take a screenshot or, and this will also be part of the PDF that I do have get posted. Let's see if it goes. Okay, so hopefully you can see that now. So, so there's a ton of resources out there about making your classroom more inclusive and starting to get down that line. In sort of the 5 steps of scientific course design, I mentioned context as being the first one. And that is actually something, there's some situational factors considered by D-Fink, similar to the Fink's significant learning taxonomy, that sort of gives a list of 10 or 15 questions for you to think about before you enter the classroom. But those are basic questions on the situation. And there's a lot of research out there now that's really looking at how you actually, you know, once you've answered those questions, how do you do it well? So I want to mention that resources like that scientific teaching book have whole chapters on this. And I teach at Columbia University in New York City, and it's a PDF online, their guide for inclusive teaching, which is sort of bringing it down into 5 different steps of how to have an inclusive classroom. I really highly recommend it. It's short, but it has a lot of rich evidence-based citations of the recommendations they give. And if this was something that really interested you, to do it justice, I do think that it does take a little bit of dedication and time. But edX, an online platform for MOOCs, or these massive online open courses, has a inclusive teaching course that Columbia actually has created that I think is a great tool or resource for folks if they are more interested in it. And so I also want to just mention Rebecca's talk. You know, it came after mine, but it was really an important part that she mentioned about sort of deconstructing some of the ideas that we have about knowledge and who's the knowledge holders, and you know, how colonialism has impacted our understanding of the education system. And I think that those are topics that it's becoming more and more frequent that you can find articles about this. Tomorrow's Professor, you know, a blog, sort of, there's more and more people talking about how to decolonize the classroom. And I think that's going to, and addressing, you know, issues of systemic racism within your actual classroom. These things are going to be talked about a lot in the upcoming months. And I encourage you, I'm not going to be able to give you all the answers here, but I encourage everyone to sort of look for resources, and I will include some again in the PowerPoint so folks have a place to jump off of. Oh, am I still sharing?
No.
Okay, good.
Great. Well, there's a question for Rebecca. Do any of your resources or guides teach undergrads how to interpret scientific figures?
That's a great question, and it tests the limit of my ability to track and know what is on the platform right now. Because one of the things that's happening, and I can follow Suzanne, as I so often do, in screen sharing to help me answer this question. One of the things that's happening now, and I'll just very briefly say that this question of access and accessibility and inclusivity, we are seeing more and more cases like this one on the platform that involve thinking about both physical disability and learning and ableism in learning and the histories of that as they affect our own traditions and the way that we structure our campuses and classrooms and field stations and so on. So that's a really interesting thing. It's one of the reasons why a lot of our media has, all of our media that is auditory. So many of our cases include a podcast that is almost like a a mini version of the case, but it's audio rather than being text. And yet there's a transcript of it, right? So one of the things that we're struggling with is inclusivity in, thinking about vision impairment, thinking about all kinds of users of the platform. That's a challenge. And so I'm thinking with the question about scientific illustrations and graphs and data representations of, complex quantitative data, like how would that need to be done to be most inclusive? But what I will say is that our catalogs include both libraries that are sort of curated or peer-reviewed, right? So the libraries that you see with a kind of icon, when you see a brand, like on this case, there's an M, that means that our faculty at the University of Michigan, our steering committee, have read and affirmed that the case is, accuracy fact-checked and up to date and so on and so forth. But many of our cases aren't in branded libraries. They're simply, this is an open access platform, right? And so a lot of our cases that come in are actually just, you see this icon, which is the shared hand. And that shared hand just means someone uploaded that case. And there's no one behind it saying, this is a good case, or it's just something someone thought was important to put on the platform, so they did. And in that catalog, there could very well be a case that looks at illustrations. I don't know offhand of one. And I was thinking in particular about, we have, for example, some of them are wonderful because they really do a lot of hand-holding. For example, this one about Greece, which is by an ecologist on our faculty, Johannes Fofopoulos, really walks people through modeling and gives them an opportunity to do some remedial modeling of, goat herds and using tools. We do have story mapping cases. We have cases that use ArcGIS. We have a few that use our Shiny. Many of the cases on our platform, but illustrations, I don't think so. I don't think I've seen a case that explicitly looks at that. I have had some proposals for cases using graphic novelist and that kind of storytelling technique that would actually take you through the way that a scientific story could be told in that graphical way. And some of these applications, like the one you see here in Johannes's case, the modeling exercise itself does have implications for data analysis and thinking visually about a set of parameters and changing those parameters and seeing what happens and so forth. So I do think that there are orthogonal cases, but I don't think we explicitly have that. I would welcome it. Please reach out to me. That would be really cool.
Rebecca, I just want to jump in case folks don't notice that there's also a chat box that I know attendees can't chat in, but I have been just putting a couple of resources that are external, but then a couple of resources in the NCEP collection, one of which is an exercise that looks at students improving their data analysis skills. And so that is one of the exercises I mentioned in our study. It's in our What is Biodiversity module, and I have a hyperlink to that page. And it brings students through the process of data analysis and has a rubric of, and sort of understands what it means to interpret this information. And so there are some things out there, but I just would say if you're noticing your students are having a hard time interpreting figures, making them is one way to help them actually understand the process. So I've also put in the chat a couple of resources to help make figures and best practices. But another thing to think about with your students is to break it down. So sometimes I do is I put on a figure on a slide and I only have the axes first. And then I add one axis and I explain that information. Then I add the y-axis and I explain that information. Then I add data systematically. So you can manipulate a figure while you're teaching it to scaffold the information so they don't just get overwhelmed with all of this information. And then what you can do is have students do it themselves. So I've done exercises where students have an information about the caption in a figure, then they work in small groups to come up with how will we teach this? What does this tell us? They work together and collaboratively to interpret it and learn from each other. And then they can present it to a larger group, and then you can get feedback on how other people interpret it. Those are just some ideas of how you might teach how to do data interpretation.
That's a really good point. And there's the classic Ed Tufte work too, the visual display of quantitative information books, the envisioning information book, which are just, I found them in my own quantitative display. You know, I found them extremely useful for that kind of literacy when I was myself a student. And they were, you know, he printed them out of his garage. They have a wonderful history, those books. So
Could you put that reference in the chat?
I just did.
Okay, great.
So I have a question for all of you. How did we go about measuring impact, or how should we be doing assessment of our courses, whether they're in the field, they're online? And you guys have come up with so many clever and interesting ideas. I think a challenge for all of us is how do you really know you're having impact? And I'd like to start with Ursula and Jenny and go on to Susan and then Rebecca.
Great, thank you. That's a really great question. It's a very big challenge. And I think there's been some articles that actually have evaluated through surveys. And I think we cited a couple of them, and I can post them soon. I think, you know, collecting information about the students, and one of the things that's really hard is to, and then at the University of Washington, we've been trying to do this, to track the trajectories, even in the less formal and more formal ways. And I bet there's, you know, I want your contributions after this. But things like, you know, how many letters of recommendation you write for students who are moving on into another course. That could be another thing. How many of them are going into grad school and taking tropical ecology, or, you know, taking some of the field, some of the, using some of the skills that they learn with us. How many of them are publishing about things related, right? Some of those things could be used. And then it has happened at least how many are actually leading field courses, how many are starting field courses. And again, that's, you know, the proportions maybe much more less, but, or how they're using education and applying the techniques that they learn into their own project, into their own teaching practices, either with things that they learn, and then how many innovations they did too, based on what they learned. So I think that's just one approach, and I bet you guys can contribute with many more, but that's part of what we're trying to do, and collect more data about that.
I can jump in. When it comes to, you know, assessing student learning, obviously that's hopefully part of your course already, and you've come up with some way to measure their learning. But if you're thinking more broadly about whether a technique works better than the other, you know, there's a lot of research out there, specifically, you know, what I focus on looking at active teaching techniques. And there's a paper called Friedman et al. 2010, I believe, or what, 2012. Anyway, I have that reference in the list of references, and it looks at a meta-analysis across classrooms and using active teaching and not. And so if you wanted to do something very specifically, like I explained, actually doing a little bit of a study within your classroom, what if this particular exercise has an impact in learning, that's one approach you could do on a small scale. But there are these like syntheses across classrooms, programs on teaching and what works well. And it's accepted now that active teaching works. But now we're getting into what Friedman calls the next generation of these questions, which is how much and in what way. So actually looking at what types of interactions work the best, in what platforms, for how long, how many times throughout the semester, who does it benefit most? All of those things are currently being researched in the field. And so, you know, if there was something that you really wanted to answer regarding some of those questions, I do encourage to take a look and see, you know, who is actually publishing on these types of things and what are the methods they're doing to measure. It really depends on what you are looking at for your particular question of success.
Jenny?
I think I would say something very similar to what Suzanne said. So part of the role I had at OTS was more of a director sort of position. And so I had to think about how are we assessing these programs and whether they're worth it and whether one way is better or another. And at the end, we kept coming back to this idea of, are we more interested in how it affects a student's career, or are we more interested in whether the course is effective? And those are not necessarily the same thing. And so in the same way that we would ask, are nutrients helping the forest or do nutrients help forests? We would design two very different experiments. And so I think when you're thinking about testing for the impacts of a course, you need to think about what is my hypothesis, right? As we're trained very early on. Do I want to know if the lecture that I gave today succeeded in teaching a certain concept and getting through to the students on a deep level? Or do I want to know whether this course in general is more likely to keep the student in a scientific career? Evaluating impacts is a very broad scale, and there are people that dedicate their lives to this kind of thing. And so my suggestion would be probably connect with people like Suzanne, who are education researchers, and get some insight into your specific hypothesis for your teaching style, because it's a big area of study, and to say just one thing I think is not good. One thing I will say is that I've over the years slowly incorporated, not so much in field teaching, but in campus teaching, at the end of each course, asking something so that you have some formative along the way sort of evaluation so that you can keep adapting your course as the semester goes on. But that's one thing. And then years later, how did that affect the student is hard because you have to follow them, but very important. And so, yeah, I think defining well, what are your goals with evaluating impacts will guide you to what kind of evaluation you need.
Yeah.
Rebecca, I think it's obvious I'm a fan of GALA, and I really want to see it to be successful in the long term. And I'm not sure what funding you have to keep it going, but I can imagine whoever is funding you would like to see some measure of success or impact. Mm-hmm. Running a platform is very different than just giving a class and having a room of students. Do you guys have a structure in place to try to measure the impact of GALA?
We do, Mitch. Thanks for asking. And I say that not with the confidence that we have the right one in the ways that Jenny just suggested one should be circumspect about. It really is a challenge, and not the least of those challenges are the ethics of collecting information from users of a platform in this moment. So we are very, very engaged in answering those questions. We have options for instructors, including a very easy pre and post test feature, which can be custom designed by an instructor so on the, there's several levels, right, of the possible assessment question. Number one, the one Jenny suggested, how's that module working? Was the content in the module assimilated and understood? And there's a very basic level there. And for that, we have these pre-post tests that instructors can modify. They can use multiple choice or open-ended questions. And I'm really proud of my colleague, Dr. Megan Wagner, who, as a geoscientist, a geochemist of silver in oceans, has brought a lot of her scientific literacy to this project, but also learned a lot about educational assessment. She helped us modify those features to be more supple, to include either multiple choice questions for larger courses or open-ended questions for smaller classes, in which you really want to get into the self-assessment of students about how their beliefs or thinking about a complex phenomenon has shifted by using the module. And those are automated. So if you do deploy one when you make your module or use one of the modules in your class, right, on the platform, you decide if you want the pre-post test. And if you do deploy it, the module will not unlock for the learner until they take the pre-quiz, which means you do have an opportunity to ensure that you get that information about where they started on a given set of content questions or, complex phenomena. And then you do have to prevail upon them to take the exit quiz, right, to get the sort of pre-post self-assessment thing to happen. So that's one level of assessment, and that's been really interesting. And our publications, of course, lag behind because so much of the data we've collected until now has been formative, in the sense that we develop modules. Many of the modules you see in our collections right now have spent up to a year or two in what we call our nursery. GALA is the name of an apple variety grown in Michigan. So there's a whole orchard metaphor to what we're doing here. Apple for the teacher, maybe. But many modules are made and they are implemented in a class using these pre-post tests, or a survey that we have on Qualtrics that can be adapted by instructors, or classroom observations we have worked with the Center for Research on Teaching and Learning at the University of Michigan to develop both quantitative and non-quantitative measures for the ways that these things are getting used in classes, depending on what instructors want to know. And so all of this is happening under an IRB approval that Michigan has. And we're using our own campus really as kind of a fishbowl to figure out how these things work and for whom and in what cases. There's that front end pre-post test. There are also, of course, back-end data about, and we actually, Megan is leading right now a paper for IEE transactions in higher education, looking at some early figures we have on a given module's use across undergrad and grad classrooms, and looking at the ways that undergrad and grad students use the multimodal features differently. The podcast, the videos, the edge notes, and trends in, we can also look at, for example, if we pull data from our university, we can look at international students versus US-based educated students, right? There are all kinds of questions we can ask about how the platform design is working for them, and we are asking. And some of the modules you see have been through an intensive process of that kind before being finalized and placed on the platform. We have nearly 100 in the nursery now that have been taught once or twice. We're sort of moving through that with the instructors, looking at the information we have, and revising the modules on the basis of that information before they become published. So I think the future is pretty bright, particularly because we're not Coursera or edX. We're a small community. We're a much, much smaller, deeper community of practice that is engaged in partnerships with our makers and our users to try to answer really interesting questions. Sustainability is a tough, big topic.
Great. And on that note, we're kind of getting to the end of the time. So I wanted to just give the speakers one last chance to kind of summarize, your final thoughts or recommendations or take-home messages. Maybe start with Jenny.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for inviting Ursula and I to participate with this talk. We had a great time putting our heads together and joining ideas. And I think if I were to wrap up after going through this exploration of what do we want to put in this talk, an idea that kept coming back as a central point was when you're designing a course or as an educator, maybe this is obvious but worth stating, is that you as the educator are deciding whose voices get to get heard. And so decide who you want to empower, whose voices are being left out, whose voices are being over magnified, because as the designer of a course, you're the one that chooses that. And so most people love sharing their ideas. And so if you invite someone else, they're probably going to be open to participating, but you get to make the decision about who it is that's participating, both at the student level and at the expert or professor level. And so think wisely about who and maybe a little bit less about where. That would maybe be my suggestion.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, actually, kind of create communities of learning rather than us always be like the delivering of information or experiences. It create a very inclusive environment. I think there was a question associated to what the local communities want of this, or how could they benefit? And I think a very important factor of that is to actually incorporate those collaborators in the designing of these activities and ask them what they want, not what we decide, or how can we use that help? Because a lot of times it's actually, people use it as help. And actually we need to acknowledge with all the things that you guys mentioned before is that their traditional knowledge, it really complements a lot of like what our goals are in terms of understanding nature. So given that voice is very important to not only those communities, native communities, but every participant be part of the community learning and incorporate them in all this process. Mm-hmm.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I can go next. I also want to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I feel like there's been so much information that's been shared in this, and that's wonderful. So I would say my sort of parting advice would be easy on yourself. There's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of things that you can do when you're thinking about your teaching. And just start small. Hopefully something in this talk, our 3 talks, has inspired you to maybe look a little bit further into the literature or look for a professional development event that could help support you understanding that better. And, you know, just take some steps forward, whether that be on learning more about inclusive teaching or decolonizing your classroom, adding more stakeholders' perspectives into your curriculum, adding more moments of reflection for your students or active participation. Any of those things, any movement forward is going to help improve your teaching and the experience for your students. So, you know, don't get too overwhelmed with all of the things you can do. Select something that really interests you and make some movement on it is my ending suggestion.
That's a great one, and I'll assume I'm the last in the queue, and we are indeed out of time. But I will say that I'll pick up on a comment from Jenny earlier about does this help people stay in or get into scientific careers question, and just say that, you know, for the first time, we have the capabilities to build tools that are generous and iterative and truly rooted in a community of practice in this virtual sense. That's so exciting. And I want to just remind all of you that this is an invitation to join us in the collaborations we're creating in these directions, whether it's through using the GALA platform or engaging with NCEP or thinking about your field course in the ways Jenny and Ursula have offered, or looking at us up in OCELOTS. It really is wonderful to watch. We have this week multiple papers coming out in journals that are by students about the modules they created with their instructors as undergraduates. And it may be 3 years later now that the module's been up. But because the module itself is iterative, they've revised it over the time. As the issue itself has unfolded, they've been able to revise it. And now they're publishing about that process, which is all just to say, give yourself time. Because what I'm seeing is that in our learning community, in our user community of GALA, people begin with a first step. Maybe they make a module, then they remake the module, then they update the module, then and then they write about it and publish about it. And the whole thing can take half a decade, but it's all good. And it's incremental steps toward improvements that are so beneficial to ourselves, our partnerships with our students, and our communities. So I think that's the thing, is that there is the time to be taken and wonderful new tools to use. So I want to thank all of you for helping me on that journey by being here today. Particular thanks to Anne and to Mitch, who have been really generous on-point moderators. You guys have been great.
Thank you. No, I would just like to wrap up thanking all of you. I mean, for me, I felt like I've learned a lot here. And like Suzanne was saying, I'm gonna need some silence time to process it all. The other people I'd really like to thank are Lucia and Maga. I think it's really been great that you guys have made this effort to put on all of these webinars. It's unfortunate that we couldn't have our annual meeting, and it looks like we're not gonna, I'm not sure if we're gonna have the next one. It's a little tiring, all these Zoom meetings, but I really appreciate the effort that the two of you have done to give us the opportunity to share that. So thank you to everyone.
Yeah. And I just want to thank everybody too. It's just been awesome. And it's a great group to get to work with. Like Mitch says, I was hoping to get to dance with everybody in Cartagena, but we'll do it eventually. All right. And with that, I think we'll sign off. Bye.